Alright guys, so today we're making a bath tray caddy, or a bath tray. This is for any standard size bathtub. This one's 9 inches by 38 for dimensions. Almost all the cuts are made for 3/4, including the slats. If you look at it, we wanted to make it out of black walnut because black walnut does well naturally against water, even though this isn't meant to get wet. We coated it with 2 coats of polyurethane. We put in a cell phone holder right there with a live edge. We've also put in a wine holder. That way you can slide your glass in, not worry about it tipping over. And then there's 2 slats in the middle that have notches for your Kindle, your tablet, and it's strong enough that it could hold an entire laptop if you wanted to just set your laptop on it while enjoying a nice, luxurious bath. So here we are. We, like most people, have learned our lesson with wood. We don't just build immediately. We bring it into the shop, throw it up on the shelf, and let it sit for a few weeks. That way it can acclimate to the temperature that it's in. Now this wood, we spent about $77 on it, and we sourced it locally from a local sawmill. Just a guy that, you know, anytime a storm comes through or somebody has a tree that gets cut down, he goes, picks up the tree if nobody else wants it, or he buys it for a small price, and then he cuts it, kiln dries some of it, and the rest of it he just kind of lets it sit in a large metal building that he's got. And we went over there a few times, picked up a couple of different types of material. Now we're pulling out the planer. Unlike a lot of people, I don't have a nice cool rig to where I can just flip it out. We just have to pick it up, manhandle it where we want it, and work out the space and sorting that we need. Now when we started planing, we went ahead and we knew in our head the dimension that we wanted the wood to be. We wanted it to be 3/4 inch thick, and that's what we were going for. So of course the planer gets set a little bit above 3/4, and we bring it down to the setting we want. This will take out any of the cupping or rough edges because this is all rough sawn lumber. And as you can see, it's getting smoother and smoother. Just make pass after pass. Some of these passes I took a little bit too much off. Typically you want to do like an 1/8 or less on the material removal. That way you're not being too rough on your planer and everything comes out nice and smooth. Talking about tools we don't have a joiner, right? So we can't make that small edge nice and straight. So the way around that is we take a piece of Baltic birch plywood that we've got and we screw it down to our workbench. We take exactly a blade's width off of that wood, so we kind of slide it into place. As you can see here, we leave half of it or a third of it with the piece that we chopped off. We don't take a blade's width off of it. That way we can use the manufactured edge that should in theory be straight on most wood to create our straight edge. We're just going to take small shallow passes, a blade's width at a time, on both sides of this black walnut until we get a board that is straight on both of the long edges. It's a little bit of a process. I definitely want to get a joiner in the future, but for now this worked for us and seemed to turn out pretty well, better than I thought it would. Now another way we probably could have done this was with a router table and a flush trim bit and just slowly taking passes like we are with the table saw and worked it out that way. So there's a multitude of ways to do it if we don't have a joiner. I just felt like because we had the table saw set up, I wanted to try this method. It was something I'd seen on YouTube and I wanted to kind of verify that it would work well for me and that I could do it properly. And the results kind of speak for themselves. It definitely came out the way that I needed it to finish up this project. Like any new project, especially if you're a new woodworker like me, you constantly run into different problems. So here we're taking off the cover, pulling out a slat that fell in the middle, right? So this is where we're trying to cut the board, which we've already got at 3/4 width, into the individual slats that are going to be on the bath tray itself. You need a 0 clearance around that blade. I don't have the cover that would make that 0 clearance, so our workaround is going to be what many people do, and that's taking some tape and we're going to put it over the top of this table saw. However, my table saw has kind of experienced a bunch of rust. So you'll see me struggling with the handle trying to get it to raise and lower because I wanted to lower it down so that I could put the tape over the cover and then raise the blade while it's running up through the tape. That way I don't have to do anything sketchy, which as you'll see, I'm trying to get the handle, I'm just moving it up, moving it down, trying to get it to break loose of the rust, putting a little bit of strength on there, and then I break it, of course. So this is something I would definitely recommend don't do at all, even if you are confident in not chopping your fingers off. But I went ahead and stuck the tape on, turned the saw on, and I'm going to just take the tape tightly across the top of that blade as it's spinning. So don't do it. It's not a smart move, but this is in the middle of the night. Had this project on my list for a very long time, so I was very adamant about getting it done. And as you can see, it works fine. You know, no danger. I make sure I stay several inches away with my fingers. Blade cuts right through the tape, doesn't bind up on it, thankfully. That's one concern I had, is that it was going to bind up and take it down in there with it. So not the best solution, but it worked for me on this one so that I could continue with the project without having to delay it any further. Now we're going to take a slat that we cut earlier that we know has the 3/4 inch height that we need and is the same width that we're hoping for, and use that as a spacer off of our table saw fence to give us the proper spacing between that and the blade so that everything will match going forward. The biggest thing on this is we were trying to keep, like we said, the dimensions at that 3/4 for as much of this board as possible, because we're trying to make a repetitive build that in the future we can easily replicate with a table saw and router table. So here we're just going to start sliding the board across, cutting these slats. You could have cut this into on your miter saw first, into shorter pieces, and then maybe done it all as a chop saw kind of setup. But definitely doing this on the table saw, I would say, is the fastest and easiest way, while getting the most accuracy and keeping a straight cut. Just mind those fingers when you're pushing it through. If I didn't have a few inches between me and the board, I would probably be using a push stick. And then I would turn it off in between and pull the slats out once the blade was done spinning, because it would just sit there, and being such a small piece, I didn't want to risk breaking it. One thing to be mindful of in that is when you move the board away from it, watch the top of it that you don't put too much pressure on it and cut the piece that you just created. And of course, before we can assemble anything or finish any product, we have to sand it. I took these from 120 to 150 up to 220, just to make it as smooth as possible, because people are going to be, using it in the bath. Don't want anything to catch on or cut. And if you guys, I'm not going to put all the sanding in here, but just be mindful that I did sand before I put anything together. So as soon as every piece was in its final phase, like these slats are, or final dimensions, I would go ahead and sand it just to save myself some effort later, because trying to get a orbital sander in there would be a painful process. Once the sanding is completed, we stacked the boards on top of each other so we could make very precise cuts. I am leaving these slats just a little bit longer than they need to be to make sure that we can get the proper width that we want on the board, and if I make a mistake, it gives me a little bit of wiggle room to sort of fix things down the road, and correcting it, as you'll see later in the video, is pretty quick with a flush trim bit. Now this is a Bosch router table that I bought from Lowe's, a big box store, nothing fancy about it. And this is a sled that I made for it real quick. I just watched a couple of YouTube videos, used a 3/4 inch router bit, and that's what that slot is that you see in the center, and I lined everything up, made sure it was perfectly level, because I only have one channel to run it through, so the other side is just sitting flat on the table itself. So you want to make sure that board is level, make sure your screws are recessed, which is what I did here, and you'll see that I am spacing this out exactly the width of the slat, which is 3/4 inches, just to make life easy, because you've got to do that first cut. I did split the board, the little notch that I'm trying to use. I split the first one, so definitely pre-drill everything. Save yourself a little bit of a headache like I had. Now we trimmed it down some so we could get to it easier, and as you can see, I did some test cuts just to make sure. You don't see those in this video. And then we just, we're basically creating teeth like a gear, and you're just going to raise and lower it every time you want to go through. And it's going to give you the exact spacing you need on this board. And then we'll do the same thing on the other board, starting from the mirrored side. That way they'll line up perfectly and we won't have any deviations in it. Some movement does happen if you try to do it this way. As you can see right there, the table sort of picked up a little bit. We'll fix this down the road once we get the shop built out a little bit better, by building a better router table that we can put a sled in that actually has 2 grooves, 2 channels that it can run through. That way it'll sit flush and won't have as much room to wiggle. The other thing I've noticed with this Bosch table, or Bosch router table, is even though I've cut this board with a little bit of space left on it, it would still bind up and get stuck on occasion. I was constantly having to blow wood out of it. I'm not sure if that's common with any of these channels that we try to run stuff through. It seems like all the other sleds I've seen on the other channels work pretty well. This one did okay. For a first attempt, I think it's getting the job done. Now again, before we moved on to the next stage, we went ahead and sanded both of these boards down to 220, just to make sure everything's nice and good to go, make it easier on us later. And here's where you're going to see just how much of a novice I am when it comes to using a router table or any other tool in the wood shop. So I'm following the direction of the feed, but as you'll see, this router table is about to just snatch it out of my hands and shoot it across the room. Luckily nobody was standing over there, since I work by myself most of the time. but I thought it was a pretty funny thing to throw in here. I just wanted to show you guys my mistake. Could have easily caught my finger too if I wasn't being mindful of what I'm doing. Now you see me flip the board over, and you'll see some smoke coming from it because I'm being a little bit too cautious and too slow. So it's just heating up the bit and heating up the wood a little bit too much. Definitely keep a fire extinguisher close by. I haven't set anything on fire yet, but still learning the processes and how to use all these tools as I go. This was the best way I could find to cut the channel that we need to put the shelves in. Some people prefer to use the dado stacks on a table saw. It's just a lot easier. And from the videos I've seen, it seems like that'd be the better way to go if you guys don't have a router table. And you can do the same thing with the slots where your slats are going to end up going. You don't have to have a router table to do this build at all. You just need to have a decent table saw. So now we're putting glue in, and the way that I did this is I cut 3 spacers so that I could hold the board tight together. And I'm using a pin nailer. That way I don't have to try to clamp each individual piece as we slide this together. And I started on the outsides and worked my way in. That way I could make sure I'm putting enough pressure to pull the wood together, because as you guys know, wood likes to move over time. This has been sitting on my workbench for quite a while at this point. And I was using 1-inch nails. When you're doing the nails, make sure that you're mindful of not putting it directly in the center of the board, because you do have that channel that you cut out on the back side that you want to keep available and not have nails sticking through that you have to try to repair later. We use Type Bond 3, that's the green bottle. It's got water resistance, supposedly per the label, so we wanted to make sure we use that since we're going to be in a bathroom. And as you can see, I'm using a board to push against the sides of this black walnut tray to make sure I put enough pressure and force while pulling it together. That way the glue and the nails will hold it square. So what I did with the extra pieces, because we cut extra slats, is I took them with some painter's tape and I just wrapped them up nice and tight, that way they wouldn't fall loose. And we went ahead and labeled on the painter's tape itself the size and dimensions of each slat. So in this case it's going to be 3/4 inches by 9 inches roughly. And then we also put the name of the project that we were working on, which is just a standard bath tray. So in the future, if we go to make one of these, we won't need to cut as much wood. We'll just have to cut a few and go from there. Now we're moving into the final phases. We're going to go ahead and clean up the board. So we swapped out the bit on the router table. We put a flush trim bit on there. We raised it to the perfect height just to cut enough of it to take off the slats. And this was the easiest way I could come up with doing this. Another way, if you don't have a router table or a router in general, you could use your table saw and run it through it and just use the blade to chop off any excess. And that should work just fine. I just thought this would be a better way to get a more perfect cut without as much human error. Alright, so now we're moving over to the miter saw because we want to go ahead and get our shelves cut. We just cut it to the dimensions of the interior size of the board, and we made these as tight as we possibly could. We weren't going to use any brad nails in these. These are only going to be glued in, but as you can see, we get the cuts extremely precise, so they're very tight against the rails. That way we can flip it upside down, shake it, one pops loose, but just barely, and that just shows you that we're trying to keep it as close together as possible. In order to give this board a more unique appearance, we also kept the live edge on the shelves. We could have made it square, we could have turned them to the outside, and it would have looked more like a handle, but I thought that would be an interesting touch, make it a unique piece that nobody else would have or be able to mimic. Now we're swapping over to a handheld router, and we are going to have a bowl bit on it, and that's what we're using to cut out the cell phone holder. It is center. I know it looks a little bit off, but it's definitely centered. We marked everything out with a square before we started cutting it, but the live edge makes it look like it's not perfectly square when it is, and you have to kind of account for that whenever you're making these cuts into a very characteristic piece of wood. Using this bowl bit, I would say I wish I had a bigger face on this router. I do have a plunge router that has the bigger face, but then I can't see what I'm doing. So trying to stay in between the lines, I try to do the outside first, work my way in. Not sure if I was following the proper guidance on the way that you need to push your router, but I definitely got a little bit uneven, and you see some lips and edges in there. Not a big deal. It's pretty easy to fix with some sandpaper and a few multiple passes. We could have also sunk the router a little bit deeper and taken more wood out if we really needed to, but I was trying to make sure that the cell phone would be easy to grab. The cell phone that I used in this instance for measurement is my Samsung Note 20. So it's one of the biggest cell phones on market. It's also on an OtterBox, so it's going to be more than big enough to fit any cell phone that anybody has in the future in the slot. And you could always use it for snacks if it ever becomes too small. Now for the last piece of this puzzle are the two mobile slats that go in the center. We cut in multiple slots, that way they could fit Kindles, tablets, cell phones. One is cut very firm so it'll hold in place as a sort of spacer that we don't have to remeasure every time or have to adjust both of them every time. And the other one we left somewhat firm, but you could easily move it back and forth. That way any device you have that you want to slide in here, it's going to support it and hold it in without worrying about flipping into the tub. I'd like to thank you guys for watching the video. If you've made it to this point, if you could subscribe, leave a comment below, tell me what I can do better. I am working on doing all that I can to do better audio, better video, better quality in general. So I've got a lot of projects coming up in the future, and I appreciate all the support you give us.